The 20th century was an age that began to turn away from the morality and faith that had defined previous generations. By the mid-1940s, the world had been darkened by 2 world wars and experienced a mass genocide on a level never before conceived possible, and was on the edge of a mutually assured destruction. Yet during this time, one of, perhaps the greatest Christian apologist of all time, Clive Staple Lewis, better known as C.S. Lewis, was a shining example of someone who has completely been taken over by Christ. His works continue to influence countless theologians to this day. It's hard to discount the impact that C.S. Lewis has had in the decades since his death. But what is more insightful is his spiritual journey, which began with devout atheism and transformed into the definitive Christian apologist of the 20th century. Hi, my name's Clayton, and you're listening to the Imitator Series, a production of the Isaiah 43 Ministries. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, the Apostle Paul writes, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." In doing so, the Apostle Paul sets forth an example that we should follow in our spiritual journey. Throughout the 2,000 years of Christian history, many have been imitators of Christ, thus being great examples for us to follow. They strive to live lives that resemble Christ, and now we can look at them as inspiration. Throughout this series, we will examine apologists, politicians, soldiers, theologians, authors, fathers, mothers, and more, as we explore the lives of those who inspire us to be better followers of Christ. C.S. Lewis was born in Belfast, Ireland on November 29th, 1898. Lewis grew up surrounded by books. His parents, members of the Church of Ireland, were avid readers, and they passed this love for literature to their son. His father, Albert, and his mother, Florence, encouraged their children to pull out books from the family library. They would often read to the children aloud, but they also encouraged C.S. and his older brother, Warren, to read on their own. As he recalled in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy,
"There were books in the study, books in the dining room, books in the cloakroom, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing, books in the bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds."
Lewis recalls that his favorite books to read were the adventurous books of Sir Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, E. Nesbit, Mark Twain, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. From those epic stories of adventures and knights in shining armor, Lewis would begin to write and illustrate his own stories. It is no surprise, then, that Lewis would become a literary mastermind in his adult life. At 4 years old, Lewis found a little dog in a nearby village that he came to love. This dog's name was Jaxie. Tragically, one day, Jaxie would be accidentally killed. This devastated Lewis. It would be the first tragedy that Lewis would experience, and ultimately, it would be a feeling that he would become all too familiar with throughout his life. Lewis took the nickname Jack in honor of his fallen companion, and this nickname stuck with him for the rest of his life. In 1905, Warren Lewis, Jack's older brother, would be sent off to boarding school in England. C.S. was only 7 years old. His brother was his best friend, and once again, this devastated him. He retreated into his books and hid away. He became less and less social. But as if this was not enough, in 1908, Lewis's mom, Florence, would pass away from cancer. It was 3 months before his 10th birthday. His father would never recover. For years and years after, the 2 Lewis brothers would never again feel the warmth of the love of 2 parents. A church had always been a fundamental part of growing up in the Lewis household. Yet after the death of his mother, the separation from his brother, and now a father who had become emotionally distant, C.S. became convinced that the God that was discussed in the church was cruel and careless about humanity. Around 1911, while at boarding school, Lewis abandoned the Christianity of his youth and became an avowed atheist. In the years that followed, Lewis was alone, isolated, and alienated. He had finally begun to develop a friendship with a fellow student, Arthur Greaves, but that was not able to last for very long. In 1914, Lewis was sent to be privately tutored by W.T. Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick introduced Lewis to Greek, Latin, and Italian literature, and helped introduce him to the German language. An even greater challenge was that Kirkpatrick pushed Lewis to know these classical works in their original language. The work that Kirkpatrick did with Lewis helped sharpen his critical thinking and analysis. In 3 years, Lewis quickly became a tough-minded, quick-thinking bibliophile. Of Kirkpatrick, Lewis would write,
"My debt to him is very great, my reverence to this day undiminished."
Once again, with the help of Kirkpatrick, Lewis would enter into Oxford University in 1917. This school would become his favorite place. It was here that Lewis had finally found a place where he belonged. However, for a time, he would be sent away to defend his newfound home. World War I had been raging in Europe since 1914, but at the age of 18, Lewis could finally enlist in the war effort. He joined the British Army despite being exempt due to being Irish. As a Christian many years later, Lewis would argue that sometimes war is justifiable and necessary. But nonetheless, he was made part of the Somerset Light Infantry. Within a year, he had become a second lieutenant, and by 2 years, he was leading his unit in the trenches. Unfortunately, in April of 1918, German soldiers made one of their last major attacks on the French, and Lewis's men were in the heat of combat. The Germans had amassed a great army to make a final push into what is known as the German Spring Offensive. Since the Russians had dropped out of the fight due to their communist revolution, the extra supplies and troops were sent to make a final push into the Western Front. As per usual during the combat of the First World War, both sides began launching massive artillery fire at one another. On April 15th, Lewis would be hit by shrapnel that injured his left side, particularly his leg, wrist, and lung. Lewis would go on to say,
"Just after I was hit, I found, or thought I found, that I was not breathing and concluded that this was death. I felt no fear and certainly no courage. It did not seem to be an occasion for either."
As he had been sent back to England to recover from his injuries, Lewis began writing once again. For him, this was how he dealt with the pain, the heartache, and the troubles of war. Not only did he write stories and essays, but he also dabbled in poetry. Much of this poetry surrounded his anger towards God, and why would God allow such terrible things to happen? Because of the way his mind worked, this started leading him in the path that would open the door to becoming the C.S. Lewis that we all know today. After he was fully recovered, Lewis immediately went back to Oxford. He pursued all of his studies with great academic fervor. As one source has said of Lewis's life at Oxford during this time, quote, "With no particular purpose in life beyond stimulating his imagination, feeding his intellectual curiosity, and writing for publication and prosperity, he thoroughly enjoyed academic life." End quote. In 1919, he published his first book under the pseudonym Clive Hamilton. This book was titled Spirits in Bondage. This book was a collection of 40 poems that revealed where Lewis's heart towards God was during this time. This is a reoccurring theme in this book, that God has instilled in mankind desires that he can never have, and if man did have them, then he would never truly be satisfied. In the following years of 1920, 1922, and 1923, Lewis would take the highest honors at the colleges in what we would know as modern-day education, classical literature, and English. It would be in 1920 that Lewis would complete his first degree. At this time, he was also caring for Miss Janine King Moore and her daughter Maureen. He moved them in with him so he could take better care of them. He had done so because Miss Janine Moore was the mother of Lewis's roommate and wartime friend, Pattymore, who ended up being killed in combat around the same time Lewis had been injured. In 1923, Lewis was beginning to see things differently. Some have suggested that it was here that Lewis was beginning to have a spiritual awakening. After watching Miss Janine Moore's brother go through a nervous shock due to wartime PTSD, her brother had terrible mental torture and truly believed he was in hell. Lewis wrote to a friend of his suggesting that this is a cursed world, and how in the world did he ever think that people could have been happy with books and music and other materialistic things. In 1924, he became a philosophy tutor, and in 1925, he was elected a Fellow of the Magdalene College, where he tutored in English and literature. Yet Lewis's life was only truly beginning. In 1926, Lewis met one of the most influential people of his life, and arguably one of the most influential people in the whole world, J.R.R. Tolkien. Though Tolkien had not yet become the world-renowned author of The Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings series, he did become immediate best friends with C.S. Lewis. The two greatly enjoyed each other's companies. They had both found a friend who could tell a good story or a good joke, but who also shared a deep intellectual mind. And as time went on, they would often share their early writing drafts to be looked over by one another for revision. It was only a few short months later that Lewis would go on to publish his second book, Dimer. It is another series of poems that Lewis wrote, but this time there was an overarching story. It follows the story of Dimer, who was born in a totalitarian society where the individual is forgotten in favor of the collective. Likely, Lewis would have drawn from the rise of communism that was being seen in Russia at the time. Lewis continued his spiritual journey from here, as he began to read George MacDonald and G.K. Chesterton. Another friend of Lewis, Owen Barfield, who had recently converted to Christianity himself, began pushing Lewis's logic on atheism. Another fellow student, Neville Coghill, also joined in. Soon, Tolkien would join them, and in 1929, Lewis adopted Christianity, and the most reluctant convert confessed his sins and confessed that Jesus is Lord. As a new believer, Lewis abandoned his attempts to become a poet. His life had a new purpose: to know, obey, and glorify God. Throughout the 1930s, Lewis published 3 new books: Pilgrim's Regress, The Allegory of Love, and Out of the Silent Planet. These books began to put Lewis on the map. While Pilgrim's Regress and The Allegory of Love were Christian apologetics in nature, but also provided some insight into discipleship and discipleship. Meanwhile, Out of the Silent Planet was his first attempt into storytelling. Long before he became known for the Chronicles of Narnia, he tried his hands at science fiction. Through these works, Lewis gained popularity, and by the 1940s, he was getting sent numerous letters. He believed that all people were equal, and spent time responding to each person regardless of where they were from, who they were, or their place in society. This consumed much of his time. Another activity that took up much of his time was the weekly meetings of the Inklings. The Inklings were a group consisting of primarily Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams, but others occasionally joined. They met to discuss their creative works and to receive feedback from one another. They typically met at the corner of the Eagle and Child pub, but they would sometimes meet in other places when necessary. In 1939, England went to war against Nazi Germany. Lewis believed that it was God's calling in his life to explain Christianity to the people and servicemen via the BBC radio. His other calling was to write, give lectures, and preach. Unfortunately, due to the technology of the time, most of the recordings of his radio addresses no longer exist. However, later these would all be collected and compiled into Mere Christianity, which would be published in 1952. In 1940, Lewis published another book titled The Problem of Pain. In this work, Lewis tackles the issues that kept him from being a believer for all those years. If a good and loving God exists, then how can evil exist? Yet Lewis's argument says that this line of logic is not sufficient enough to reject believing in God. In The Problem of Pain, Lewis writes, quote,
In the fallen and redeemed universe, we may distinguish 1. The simple good descending from God, 2. The simple evil produced by rebellious creatures, and 3. The exploitation of that evil for his redemptive purpose, which produces 4. The complex good to which accepted suffering and repented sin contribute. Now, the fact that God can make complex good out of simple evil does not excuse, though by mercy it may save, those who do simple evil. And this distinction is central. Offenses must come, but woe to those by whom they come. Sins do cause grace to abound, but we must not make that an excuse for continuing to sin. The crucifixion is the best, as well as the worst of all historical events, but the role of Judas remains simply evil. We may apply this first to the problem of people's suffering. A merciful man aims at his neighbor's good, and so does God's will, consciously cooperating with the simple good. A cruel man oppresses his neighbor, and so does simple evil. But in doing such evil, he is used by God, without his own knowledge or consent, to produce the complex good, so that the first man serves God as a son, and the second as tool. For you will certainly carry out God's purpose, however you act, but it makes a difference to you whether you serve like Judas or like John.
Despite being well known, Lewis did not have much money. He was always scarce, especially because of his responsibility to care for the Moors. Thankfully, by the 1940s, Lewis's finances would improve slightly. Yet he refused to move. The money that he made from book royalties would be sent to charities and impoverished families, and he also paid for the education of orphans and poor students attending seminary. Yet no one truly knows how much Lewis gave away. During World War II, between 1942 and 1945, Lewis published 9 more books, including the book he is perhaps known for the best, the Screwtape Letters. Old Screwtape would become a nickname of Lewis later in life. The Screwtape Letters would be Lewis's valuable insight into the study of spiritual warfare. Told from the perspective of a senior demon to a lower one on how to distract people from developing a true, sincere faith in Jesus Christ, the book forces the reader to recognize the spiritual warfare constantly happening all around them. This was, according to Lewis, probably one of the hardest books that he has ever wrote, because he had to put his mind in a dark place to try to understand how the forces of evil work. Now in 1944, Lewis gave a radio broadcast on the all-knowing ability of God. Let's listen to a quick excerpt of that now.
I've had to say a good deal about prayer. And before going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with a difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty. Well, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine a God attending to any number of claimants if only they come one by one, and he has an endless time to do it in. So what's really at the back of the difficulty is this idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that, of course, is what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there's room for precious little in each. That's what time is like.
Then, in 1946, Lewis published The Great Divorce. He is also granted an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree by the University of St. Andrews in the same year. A year later, in 1947, he would be further recognized. Shortly after publishing another great work, Miracles, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine. As the 1940s began to come to a close, Lewis published two more works, The Weight of Glory, and in 1950 he published the one book that the world would immediately know him for, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Although it was a work of fantasy, it served as a great Christian allegory. This theme would continue throughout the rest of his Chronicles of Narnia series. Christian symbolism and metaphors became an integral part of the series. Lewis made no effort to hide that it was a part of the Narnia universe. One cannot read the Chronicles of Narnia without seeing C.S. Lewis's faith on full display. This project would become his passion, and he would publish a new book every year until 1956. During the years of the 1950s, Joy Davidman Gresham became a Christian because of Lewis's works. She decided to go visit him in England, and not long after, her husband left her for another woman, and they soon divorced. She took her two boys and moved from America to London. Lewis took the family under his wing and provided financial assistance. They had fallen under hard times, and Lewis believed that it was his duty as a Christian to care for them. He helped the boys with their education, and with Joy, Lewis quickly developed a deep friendship, and this friendship turned into a romance. In 1954, Lewis moved from his beloved Oxford University to Cambridge University, where he became the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature, published another novel in the Chronicles of Narnia series, and published a book titled English Literature in the 16th Century, only 10 days apart from one another. In the following year, Lewis was enamored by Joy, and titled his autobiography Surprised by Joy, implying a double meaning for the two loves of his life, the joy brought by Christ and the joy that he married. In 1956, Lewis and Joy married, despite Joy being 16 years younger than Lewis. In the next few years, Lewis began to slow down his writings, but not by much. He publishes the conclusion to his Narnia series, Till We Have Faces, Reflection on the Psalms, and The Four Loves. It is no doubt that each one of these books were heavily influenced by Joy coming into his life. She had encouraged him to return to Christian apologetics by writing the Reflection on the Psalms. He also told a close friend that his favorite books that he had ever written was Till We Have Faces, and claimed that Joy was his co-author for the book. Sadly, however, Joy would die in 1960 from a terrible battle with cancer. Shortly after, Lewis would be diagnosed with kidney inflammation. He published two more books before his death in 1963, titled Grief Observed and An Experiment in Criticism. Criticism was something that Lewis had become well familiar with, especially considering that because of his Christian apologetic work, he was often passed over for various professorships at Oxford University. On November 22nd, 1963, at the age of 64, C.S. Lewis passed away due to kidney failure. We do not know what his last words were, but we do know that previously he knew that he did not have much time left on the earth. History scholars will also recall that November 22nd, 1963, also rocked the world with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Adjusting for the time zone differences, the two men who shaped the world in their own way would pass away only an hour apart from one another. Due to the assassination of the President of the United States, Lewis's death was overlooked in the news, and for years his stepsons and brother would continue to receive mail addressed for him. Lewis once said,
"The fact that our heart yearns for something earth can't supply is proof that heaven must be our home."
Well, 61 years ago, C.S. Lewis finally made it home. C.S. Lewis imitated Christ in his life, and now we are called to imitate him as he imitated Christ. Thank you for joining us for the first episode of the Imitator Series. Until we are brought together again next month, take care, forgive one another, and know that God loves you.